Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of the PR Report. I'm your host, Pleb Rising. In today's episode, we'll be continuing our look at the sovereign individual, this time focusing on Chapter 2's Megapolitical Transformations in Historic Perspective. This is the second episode of the report, so if you're just joining us for the first time, welcome aboard, and if you've been following along, it's nice to have you back. As a quick recap, PR Report Episode 1 introduced this book and mentioned it is about how the information age is giving rise to the sovereign individual at the expense of modern-day nation-states, and that even though it was written almost 25 years ago in 1997, it's still just as relevant today as ever. We also covered Chapter 1's The Transition of the Year 2000, the fourth stage of human society, where we took note of and unpacked the book's theme of the new revolution of power, which is liberating individuals at the expense of the 20th century nation-state, introduced the phrase the logic of violence, and touched on using the concept of megapolitics as a way to identify the hidden factors of change at play that have ultimately shaped the course of our societies all throughout history. If you haven't had a chance to watch the first episode, I encourage you to do so, as it frames our ongoing discussion of the book, which we're going through chapter by chapter. So here we are with Chapter 2, Megapolitical Transformations in Historic Perspective. Quick review. What are megapolitics? From Chapter 1, we learned that megapolitics were identified as the hidden factors that alter the boundaries where power is executed. And they said that by raising or lowering the costs and rewards of projecting power, megapolitics governs the ability of people to impose their will on others. And this is that whole logic of violence phrase that they're talking about, which is how violence is organized and controlled. They're describing megapolitics as a way to identify the hidden factors that raise and lower the cost of the returns on violence, i.e. the logic of violence. And we also saw that megapolitics can be grouped into roughly four categories: topography, climate, microbes, and technology. So why megapolitical transformations? Quote from the book is that it helps illuminate some of the major mysteries of history. And these are how paradigm changes are triggered, what the paradigm changes have in common, how to tell when these paradigm changes begin and know when they are over, how governments rise and fall, what types of institutions the governments become, the timing and outcome of wars, and the patterns of economic prosperity and decline. The authors state that by focusing on megapolitics, they are attempting to draw out the implications of the changing hidden factors that alter the boundaries where violence is exercised. So by looking and analyzing history through a megapolitical lens, they're going to draw conclusions about the logic of violence and how violence is employed. So how are we going to draw out these conclusions? We're going to do it by taking a historical perspective. So why would you want to take a historical perspective? By applying megapolitical analysis to history, we can better identify catalysts for previous shifts in the logic of violence that have resulted in societal changes and begin to make sense of why they happened. So we know that history is a great teacher. So if we're going to learn from it by peering back into history through a megapolitical lens, that should be informative. And then we should be able to start to tease out the reasons for these shifts in the logic of violence. Another reason of taking a historical perspective is that by doing this, it'll give us a chance to further contextualize and better understand what's happening currently in our culture and in our society, which will put us in a position to make better forecasts when considering future trends, and those better forecasts give us an upper hand in navigating the transition into the information age, which is the whole point of this book. Also, how can we contextualize this perspective? We can know that this transition is happening much more quickly than previously. It's more important to understand now. So they point out that previous transitions took longer and then have progressively been shorter and shorter over history. For example, in the case of hunter-gatherer transitioning to an agricultural age, that took literally thousands of years to happen, 4,000 or 5,000 years. And then in the case of the agricultural age into the industrial age, that took several hundred years, but it's only going to take decades in the case of the transformation from the industrial age to the information age, and that's going to happen within a lifespan. And it's been happening the last several decades, and so it's underway, and it's going down in our lives right now. We are all living through it, and you are living through it. And the identification of any historical period is relative to where the one doing the identifying is on their timeline. So people living in what we now call the Middle Ages didn't consider themselves as living in the Middle Ages. They were just alive, and it was like their time. And so we don't really know how future historians looking back on our current period will choose to label this epoch. It'd be the information age, you could call it a cyber society, like who knows several hundred years down the road what future historians will look back and call our era. What are some past examples of megapolitical shifts that altered the logic of violence? Again, by focusing on megapolitics, they are attempting to draw out the implications of the changing factors that alter the boundaries where violence is executed. So what are some past examples of megapolitical shifts that alter the logic of violence? And again, we're breaking these down into 4 rough categories of topography, climate, microbes, and technology. So first up, topographical changes in the megapolitical landscape. So one example that they came up with, and this isn't solely topography, it has a little bit to do with topography and climate, but it's mostly topography. They talked about in Egypt and Mesopotamia, the earliest agricultural societies emerged amongst seasonal floodplains of rivers. And because the surrounding areas were arid, the fertile soil of the floodplains was highly valuable, because if you wanted to farm and grow some crops, that's where it was going to happen. But the value is dependent upon the land being irrigated from the nearby river. The local river's irrigation system was paramount to unlocking the agricultural potential of the floodplains. So the irrigation systems were also such that they were controlled by a relatively small number of people, so power and influence consolidated into the small groups that controlled the irrigation systems. So farmers on the floodplain were thus incentivized to both cooperate with and participate in the local society as a way to ensure their land received water to irrigate their crop. Without irrigation, their land could not yield a harvest, and since there were no other opportunities to farm in these regions outside of those irrigated floodplains controlled by the local government, they were heavily incentivized to go with the flow. Another example of topography in megapolitics was in Greece, ancient Greece, where you had yeoman farmers within 20 or so miles of the coast that were farming olives and grapes. And these farmers who were in these fertile lands along the coast had a considerable advantage over their inland or landlocked counterparts. Because if you're not close enough to the coastal farming band, the Greek littoral, a farmer could not move their olives and grapes to the coast for shipping in a cost-effective manner. It was just too expensive to move them any great distances to get them to market. So overland portage was way too expensive. Thus, relatively small plots of coastal farmland became highly profitable. And following that, many of these farmers and landlords, along with artisans, used their wealth to purchase their own armor and weapons to participate in the citizen soldier army known as the hoplites. So this right there made their opportunity of deploying violence relatively cheaper than somebody who didn't have a profitable land and farming, like their neighbors who are landlocked. So it lowered their cost of exercising violence in that particular situation. Another megapolitical factor is climate. And the authors talked about the end of the most recent ice age around 13,000 years ago spawned the transition from a hunter-gatherer society to a farming/agricultural society. The warmer temperatures brought increases in rainfall to grassland areas, which turned them into beech forests. So unlike oak forests whose canopies let through large amounts of sunlight, beech forest canopies are thicker and more restrictive. There's a spring flush of flowers, but that's about it for growth on the forest floor, and this made foraging more difficult for the hunter-gatherers. And also, large mammals, which depended upon the grasslands, saw their population shrink due to a dwindling habitat, the grasslands turning into forests, and of the higher temps and increased rainfall. Pleistocene mammals, megafauna, were also under pressure due to increased hunting from a swelling human population during the Ice Age, which also helped contribute to their decline. So this change in climate that happened abruptly 13,000 years ago put a downward pressure on the activities that hunter-gatherers were used to engaging in order to survive, and force them or put them into a position where they needed to start searching out other ways to get by. Also, there's an episode in the 17th century that saw a considerable drop in temperatures in Europe, which resulted in shortened growing seasons, contributing to crop failures and subsequently falling incomes. This led to instability in the governing institutions, and many governments reacted by favoring mercantilism. There's also a famine at the end of the 17th century that really threw things over to the edge. So this seemingly temporary, although if you were alive at the time, it probably didn't seem temporary, 100-year or so phase of considerable cooling in the overall climate put a lot of pressure on economic behaviors and the way people were attempting to survive at that time. Another megapolitical factor is microbes. And these can be gateways to the exercise of power or barriers to the exercise of power, depending on how they work. So for microbes being a gateway to the exercise of power, European settlers exploring the New World had relative immunity to many diseases, like the measles, that they brought with them when they were exploring. But the native populations that they encountered when they were arriving in these lands that they were exploring didn't have the immunity to these diseases. So this typically resulted in decimation for the native populations with whom the explorers and settlers came into contact. But microbes could also be a barrier to the exercise of power. An example of this is when Europeans first started visiting Africa in an attempt to colonialize or conquer or explore the new lands. They did have superior military technology, but they weren't able to use it because they encountered malaria. And it wasn't until the mid-19th century when quinine became available that they could. So here's an example of microbes raising the cost of deploying violence, altering this logic of violence in this situation. Because the costs were so high, people were dying, that it didn't make sense to do that in hopes of gaining the rewards of engaging in the violence. Also, in areas where early death was commonplace, would-be soldiers and their family faced the dangers of the battlefield with less resistance. So historically, a lot of times there was high mortality rates for infants and children in general. They could die at any time, and a lot of kids didn't make it into adulthood. And so this lowered and diminished the risk of death due to warfare because people just had an overall higher tolerance or expectation of it. Previously, people had larger families because dying young was more commonplace. And as these mortality rates have fallen, so has the size of the typical family. And smaller families have a lower tolerance for warfare-based mortality. So over the last several hundred years, standards of living have risen. Medicines, vaccines, a whole spectrum of factors have contributed to increased life expectancy. And with that increased life expectancy, the typical size of the family has dropped. And when you have fewer kids, you are less tolerant of sending them off to war where they could die. And so this ultimately puts a downward pressure on imperialism. And low birth rates raise the cost of projecting power. So again, when the birth rate goes down and people aren't having as many kids, that increases that cost. Also, on the microbial front of the megapolitical factor was the example of the Roman Empire getting hit with the Antonine Plague, which was most likely smallpox, in the 2nd century. There was an estimated 5 to 10 million people that perished during that plague, and that was out of a population of around 75 million at the time in the Roman Empire, around the height. So that's anywhere between 7 and 13% of the entire population was killed during that plague. And this definitely puts a downward pressure on the empire's ability to deploy violence, simply just because enough people died that it drastically affected the armies and their ability to deploy violence. Lastly, technology, and this is the one megapolitical factor altering the logic of violence that the authors think is most predominant today and will be moving forward into the future. And again, by far the most influential factor during modern centuries. And the crucial dimensions to technological factors of the megapolitical landscape are the balance between offense and defense of prevailing weapons technology, equality and the predominance of the infantry, advantages and disadvantages of scale and violence, economies of scale and production, and the dispersal of technology. So let's take a look at these. The balance between offense and defense of prevailing weapons technology. When you have offensive capabilities that are increasing, you're going to have a predominance of projecting power at a distance. And when you can optimized for projecting power at a distance, you're going to have a larger scale government and you're going to consolidate jurisdictions as you grow. When your defensive capabilities are increasing, you're facing increased costs in projecting power, especially at the boundaries, like at your peripheral, outside of your core areas. So you're going to have a devolution of jurisdictions and ultimately resulting in smaller scale government. Then we have equality of the predominance of the infantry. So weapons tend to equalize power when they're cheap, easily employed by non-professionals, and when they enhance the military importance of the infantry. And so we have an example that was given in the book of the U.S. colonial farmers that were fighting for independence against the British, and these guys had rifles, and they were going up against British soldiers with their brown vests, and that kind of equalized the whole playing field with them because they could return firepower or launch firepower from their rifles with just as good of efficiency, if not greater effectiveness and efficiency as the British. And that is heavily contrasted with a farmer 400 or 500 years earlier in the Middle Ages who was going up against a knight, or if he wanted to defend himself against a knight, they only had pitchforks because that was all they could afford, and they would be attempting to go up against a heavily armored knight who was on horseback, who could take out probably like 30 or 40 farmers at a time if they wanted to. It was just like a lopsided battle. So this is an example of weapons equalizing power. Another dimension of technology includes advantages and disadvantages of scale and violence. So the variable here is the scale of organization required to deploy the prevailing weapons. And when the returns on violence are increasing, governments get bigger because operating at a larger scale is more rewarding. It pays off to have a big operation because the returns on your deployment of violence outweigh your costs. But when you have a small group that can command effective means of resisting an assault by a large group, sovereignty tends to fragment. Small independent authorities exercise many of the functions of the government. So an example of this would be hackers being deployed not only by nation states, but also by small organizations or individuals, or maybe even working independently by themselves. Another dimension of technology in the megapolitical landscape is economies of scale in production. So the scale of the predominant enterprises in which people gain their livelihoods. Examples, trading. When it requires a large area to function optimally, governments can extract enough off the top to maintain a large political system. But when this type of activity occurs more effectively within a small area, governments are unable to extract enough wealth to support a large-scale political system and fragment and downsize. And then the last dimension in terms of megapolitical transformations is the dispersal of technology. And they say when weapons, tech, and or tools are hoarded or monopolized, it tends to benefit larger scale governments. An example of this was European powers in the 18th century had a monopoly on machine guns. They're like the new hot tech of the time, and that helped them have an imperial expansion. But when the weapons, tech, and or tools are widely dispersed, more normalized throughout the population, not hoarded by a single group or entity or just a government, the power is more widely dispersed and governments find an optimum operational level of a smaller scale. And so again, this example is given with machine guns being more widely distributed in the wake of World War II, and then those machine guns being used to overthrow the empires that previously 100 years before had a monopoly on them. So it kind of tips the scales there. So what are some characteristics of megapolitical transformations? There's about 10 of them that they listed that are helpful to keep in mind when you're thinking about this sort of thing. So a shift in megapolitical foundations of power normally unfolds far in advance of the actual revolutions in the use of power. And a good analogy that they gave in the book, and a good way to think about this, is if you're standing outside and off in the distance on the horizon, you see a flash of lightning, and you see that flash and it happens instantaneously. You see it, but it takes several seconds or maybe a minute to hear the thunder. So when you see the lightning, the thunder is coming. It just takes some time to get there. So the lightning is a good indicator of what's to follow. And so what they're saying is these megapolitical shifts that happen, these flashpoints, usually happen far in advance of the effects being felt. So these megapolitical shifts or flashpoints are the lightning on the horizon, and the thunder would be the unfolding of the actual events that follow in the wake. They also say incomes are usually falling when a major transition begins, often because a society has rendered itself crisis-prone by marginalizing resources due to population pressures. And that seen outside of a system is usually taboo. Megapolitical transitions are seldom recognized before they happen, or even as they're happening. We'll discuss this in a little bit more detail in a second here. They also say cultural revolutions are usually involved with major transitions, and clashes between old versus new occur. Megapolitical transitions are undertaken in response to changes in the external conditions that alter the logic of violence in the local setting. So these transitions are not popular because they antiquate painstakingly acquired intellectual capital and confound established moral imperatives. The transitions are initially confined to the areas where the shifting megapolitical factors are at work, and these transitions involve social chaos and increased violence because of the breakdown of the old system. Also, the signals that a transition is on the way include corruption, moral decline, and inefficiency. The growing importance of technology in shaping the logic of violence has led to an acceleration of history, leaving each successive transition with less adaptive time than before. So what are some challenges of this approach of examining history with a megapolitical lens? The authors point out that oftentimes there's a reluctance to acknowledge or even comprehend the demise unfolding around you. So you're in this society, and a lot of times you can't even see the changes that are happening. And they gave an example of the fall of Rome, or at least historically what has been identified as the point when Rome fell, but nobody could even really tell at the time or didn't want to. And so they were referring to the event in 476 AD where the last Roman emperor of the West, Romulus Augustus, was deposed. And people had a hard time identifying it or seeing it as the fall of the empire. That they certainly didn't see that way, because one of the reasons is there had been several violent oustings of emperors all throughout the centuries, and this was nothing new, and they'd seen it so many times before, and that the army had been barbarized for centuries at that point, and so they were used to seeing this kind of thing. And the army had also regularly been declaring emperors since the 3rd century, and by the 4th century, even a lot of the officers in the army were Germanized and frequently illiterate. So Romulus Augustus's replacement didn't declare himself emperor, but convinced the Senate to offer it, along with the West sovereignty, to Zeno, the emperor of the East in Byzantium. Instead of seeing this as the official fall of the West, a lot of people declared it as a great unification and bringing together of the empire, like the opposite of what actually was going on. And it was because it was more comfortable to think of the empire's endurance, i.e. the glory that was Rome, rather than its fall, and acknowledge that it was falling apart and that barbarism was taking its place. The point so much isn't about the history of Rome here, more so a loose highlighting of events of how it was hard for people alive at the end of the 5th century of Rome to see this point in time as the moment when their empire fell. And it's also another challenge to the megapolitical analysis of history in determining the hidden causes of change is that it's culturally inappropriate to declare it's over or coming to an end. People that are alive inside of a society aren't comfortable talking about how it's breaking down or that it's going to go away, because every social system, however strongly or weakly it clings to power, pretends that its rules will never be superseded. And the more apparent it is that a system is nearing an end, the more reluctant people will be to adhere to its laws. So you want to keep it going as long as possible, so everybody's just going with the status quo. Another factor is that conventional information sources, like today we'd consider that mainstream media, cling to culturally sanctioned narratives. They won't point out what's changing and why. You got to think for yourself on this one. So in this section on what if, I'm going to talk about some of the things that haven't happened that could have happened from a megapolitical perspective that would have greatly changed the course of the last several hundred years. And one of the big ones is microbiological barriers like malaria that could have been worse and stopped Western explorers in their tracks, but it didn't. And there was like the seemingly one-way disease transfer from Europe outwards that never came from the periphery back to them. So you have these settlers and all these explorers heading out from Europe, going all over the world, Africa, South America, North America, carrying with them these diseases like measles and all this stuff that they are relatively immune to, and that the indigenous populations that they come into contact with are always on the losing end of this. They don't have immunity to this, and they just get wiped out. And so that trajectory of the disease transfer moving from Europe out, it was never reciprocated. And if it had been, there could have been a different story in terms of Western expansion being told right now. And it could have prevented them from doing a lot of things they did. So since the end of the 15th century until the time of this book's writing, at least, the impact of microbes on industrial society was ever more benign. More on this in a second. But the reason that is there was a lot of sicknesses or disease that went around, like tuberculosis, polio, and flu. But the authors were pointing out that these all paled in comparison to the megapolitical impacts of the Black Death in the Middle Ages or the Antonine Plagues in 2nd century Rome. Part of this was due to improved public health, which had to deal with the advent of vaccinations, medicines, improved modernization of treatments, overall diet, and standard of living. They said that an eruption of microparasites, such as a viral pandemic, rather than a drastic change in climate or topography, would more likely dispute the megapolitical predominance of technology. And I put down here, hello, COVID, because this is exactly what we've seen happen over the last couple of years, is that, yeah, there has been a predominance of technology on the megapolitical landscape in terms of causing change and altering the logic of violence, raising and lowering the costs of the returns on violence, and empowering individuals that want to engage in that. But within the last, almost 2 years now, but year and a half, the microbial front of the megapolitical landscape has stepped up and got itself into the game, so to speak, with COVID. And that's much more rapidly has had an impact than any sort of technological advancement in the last couple of years. And so we're seeing exactly what they were talking about, where if there was a viral pandemic, this is going to take over the predominance of technology on the megapolitical landscape. And it's not that the factors of technology that are altering the logic of violence have gone away, because they're still very much at play. It's just that the microbial front is ramped up as much as technology is right now. And so there's two main dimensions to the megapolitical landscape at play, as opposed to just one technology. It's technology and microbes. Where does all this take us? The authors say, we have no way of monitoring or anticipating drastic departures from the nature of life on Earth as we have known it. We cross our fingers and assume that the major megapolitical variables in the next millennium will be technological rather than microbiological. If luck continues to side with humanity, technology will continue to grow in prominence as the leading megapolitical variable. It was not always such, however, as a review of the first great megapolitical transformation, the agricultural revolution, clearly shows. And that forecasts the next chapter of the book, where they dig into the agricultural revolution from the hunter-gatherer society. They talk about that, but they also admit there's no way of knowing how the future is going to unfold and how these megapolitical factors are going to wax and wane and influence and go away. And so it's hard to make these predictions, but if you can identify what's happening around you, you can have a better chance of making accurate forecasts that help you in a transition.